Welcome to part 24 of our series on building a Zelda-like game in Phaser 3. If you're new here, this is part of a full series where we create a Zelda-inspired game from scratch. Check out the playlist link in the description to start from the beginning. Alright, let's dive in and start building our game world with Tiled. Now that we've finished adding our Switch game objects to our level, it's time for us to work on our chess game objects. For our chess game objects, these are going to be located in 3 of our rooms, so 4, 5, and 6. And for our chest, we're going to have 2 main types. We're going to have our small chest that our players can open up at any time. And then we'll have our large chest, which will be our boss chest. And typically, this would have our item that would help our player in our dungeon. And they would get this item if they have their boss key. Now for our chest, these can either be visible when our player enters our room, or they might be hidden and they require the player completing some type of puzzle for them to be revealed. And so for our chest object in Tiled, we'll have a custom class. So I'm going to go into our custom types editor. And so for our chest, we'll have 4 main properties. Our first one's going to be our ID. So each of our chests in our rooms will have a unique ID. And that way we can keep track of which chest we've opened, as well as when we need to reveal a chest, we'll use that target ID to target this ID. We're going to have a Boolean value if this chest is one of our big chests and it requires our boss key to open it. And then our reveal chest trigger property. This is going to be used by our game to know if our chest is immediately visible when our player enters our room, or if our player needs to do something to reveal our chest. And so this will be pressing one of our switches or defeating all of our enemies. Our last property will be our contents, and this is going to be our chest rewards enum. We'll use this to keep track of what our player will get when they open up this chest. So for our current dungeon, this would be things like a small key, our boss key, our map, our compass, or in the case of our boss chest, nothing for the time being. To start adding in our objects, we need to create a new object layer. So let's make a new object layer. We're going to call this chest. We're going to place this object layer into our room 4. Let's duplicate that layer twice. We'll move one of our layers into room 5, and we'll move our final layer into room 6. Let's copy the name of our layer, and we'll update our other layer names. And now let's start in room 4. Let's choose our Insert Tile tool. Now for our tiles, we'll actually place our chest to represent what we'll have our chest in our dungeon. We'll choose our chest texture, and let's place that in our top left-hand corner of our room. So now for our chest object, let's choose our chest class. This is now for our properties. For the chest in our room 4, our contents is going to be our small key, and that's how our player will be able to unlock our door here. Now for ID, we'll do ID 1. This is one of our small chests. We don't need to require our boss key. And now for our reveal chest trigger, this is going to be when we press one of our switches. So now let's copy our object. Let's move over to our room 5. We'll select our chest object layer, and we'll paste our chest object into our top right-hand corner here. Now this room, we're actually going to have 2 chests, and we'll have one chest that's visible when our player enters our room, and we'll have another chest that gets revealed when our player presses our switch under our pot. So for our chest on the right, we'll update our contents. This is going to have our map for our dungeon. We'll give this an ID of 2 for this room. And now for our reveal chest trigger, we want to set this to be none, so our chest will be visible. For our chest on our left, we'll have an ID of 1. And now for our contents, this will be our compass. And now for our reveal chest trigger, this will be our switch. And so to make sure we're connecting everything together properly, let's unlock our switch layer for room 5. If we choose our switch, we'll see we're targeting ID 1 and we're revealing our chest. And so for our chest here, we have our ID of 1 and we have our reveal chest trigger is tied to our switch. So let's relock our switch layer, and now we'll move on to room 6. So let's copy one of our chest objects. Let's choose our chest object layer for room 6. We'll place our chest in the middle where our big chest will be, and we'll place one more chest up in our top right hand corner. So now for our room 6, our chest in the top right hand corner, this is going to be a hidden chest that requires to defeat all of our enemies. And then our chest in our middle, this will be our boss chest. So for our chest in our top right hand corner, for our contents, this is going to have our boss key. We'll keep our ID of 1, but for our trigger, we want to do our enemies defeated. So now for our chest down here, this is going to represent our big chest, and so we're going to update our width and height of our object. So we're going to make this be 32 pixels by 32. And now for our object, our contents, we'll do nothing. For ID, we'll do ID 2. And because this is our boss chest, we'll require our boss key to unlock it. Finally, we'll set our reveal chest trigger to be none, since this chest will be visible when our player enters our room. So after we finish placing our chest game objects, our map should now look like this. And now let's lock our object layers since we're done adding our chest. Now that we finish adding in our chest game objects, we're going to work on adding our pot game objects to our level. For our pot game objects, we're just going to place these on top of our plates that we previously added in our background layer. So one thing that's different between our pot game objects we're going to add and our previous tiled objects, we won't have a custom class to represent our pots. At this time, we don't need to keep track of anything on our pot game objects, so in our game, our player will be able to pick them up and throw them at our enemies. Later on, if we wanted to add in the ability to have something appear under our pot when our player lifts it up, like maybe money or extra arrows or bombs, then we could add in a custom class and have a property to keep track of what item should spawn under that pot. So now to add in our pot game objects, we now need to create our object layer for each of our rooms. So we'll start off in room 2. Let's add a new object layer. We're going to call this pots. Let's drag that object layer into room 2. Let's duplicate that layer 3 times. And now we want to drag a copy into room 3. We'll drag a copy into room 5. And then finally we'll drag our last copy into room 6. Now we just want to update our object layer name. So we're going to copy pots and we'll update our names. So now we'll start off in room 2. So let's select our pots object layer for room 2. Let's choose our tool for inserting a tile. We'll choose our collision tile, and now we'll place our tile over our 4 plates where our pots are going to spawn in our dungeon. Now we'll do the same thing for room 3, so we'll choose our object layer, we'll add our 2 pots. We'll come over to room 5, we'll choose our object layer, let's add in our 2 pot game objects. To make sure our pots are actually being added, let's hide our switch layer, and now if we hide our pots layer, we'll see we have our 2 objects for our pots. Finally for room 6, we'll add in our 4 objects. We'll do the same thing, we'll hide our switches, let's hide our pots, and we'll see we have our 4 pot game objects. So now after we add in our pot game objects, our map should look like this. So now we're done adding our pot game objects, let's lock our object layers to make sure we don't add any additional objects to those layers. Finally, in our dungeon, we just need to add in our last object type, and this will be our enemies. For our dungeon, 4 of our rooms are going to have enemies located inside them. In our first room, we'll have our boss type enemy. In our second room, we'll have 3 enemies. 2 of them will be our spiders, and 1 of them will be our wisp. In our fourth room, we'll have 2 wisps, and then in our 6th room, we're going to have 6 enemies. 2 of these will be our wisp, and 4 of them will be our spider enemies. So now for our enemy tiled objects, we'll have a custom class called enemy, and on this class, we're going to have one property, and this is going to be called type. Our type is going to be a number property, where we can provide a value of 1, 2, or 3, and then we'll use that value to know which type of enemy to create in our game when we're spawning our enemy types. So now to start creating our enemy game objects, we need to add a new object layer to our appropriate rooms. So in room 1, let's add our new object layer. We're going to call this object layer enemies. Let's duplicate that layer 3 times. We'll update our layer names. So now we're going to drag a copy of this to room 6. We'll drag a copy to room 5. We'll drag a copy to room 4. And now we'll drag a copy to room 2. So we'll start off in room 1. We'll choose our enemies object layer. Let's choose our insert tile tool, and we'll choose our collision tile. So now for our boss object, we want to spawn our boss near the top of our level, away from our player when we enter into our room. So for this, we're going to come 5 tiles over. We'll do 2 tiles down. Now for our object class, we want to choose our enemy class. And now for our enemy type, we want to do our type 3. Type 3, this will be our boss enemy for this level. Type 2 will be our wisp enemies that'll bounce around our level. And type 1 will be our spider enemies. Now that we've added in our boss enemy object, let's move to our next room. So I'm going to copy this object here. Let's choose our enemies object layer for room 2. Paste in our object. We'll place our tile here. I'm going to copy that. We'll paste 2 more objects into our room. And so for our enemy objects we're placing, this is going to be the spawn point for those enemies when our player enters that room. For our locations, we can place them for anywhere in our room where we like them to spawn at. So now for our enemy object at the top of our room, this is going to be our wisp, so we'll update our type to be 2. For our other 2 enemies, these will be our spider, so let's update our type to be 1. Let's copy our wisp enemy. Next, we'll do our room 4. So if we choose our enemy object layer for room 4, we want to spawn a wisp near the top of our level and one near the bottom of our level. Finally, we just need to do our last room. So we've come to room 6. Let's choose that object layer. Let's paste in 2 instances of our enemy, and these will be our wisp. So for our wisp, we want to spawn those towards the top of our level, above our boss chests and our pots. And so we want to make sure our type is set to 2. And now let's copy our object, and now we want to add in our spider enemies. So for our spider enemies, we'll want to do 2 of our enemies at the top of our level, and then 2 of our enemies at the bottom of our level. So let's update our property. We'll set this to be 1. Let's copy that object, we'll paste it. We'll paste this one over here by our chest. We'll paste it again, we'll do this one at the bottom of our level, and we'll do this one at the bottom of our level. Alright, so once we're done adding in our enemy game objects, our map should now look like this. And since we're done with our enemy objects, I'm going to lock those layers so we don't add any more objects to those layers. With our enemy objects placed, our dungeon level and tiled is now complete. Now that we have all the necessary metadata, it's time to export our game data, the JSON file, and the foreground and background images required for our phaser game. So to export our required files, we'll start with our JSON file. For our JSON file, if we go up to File, we're going to do Export As, and now for our file type, we want to do All Files, and we'll want to update our file name to be dungeon_1.json. We'll want to place this in a location that we can easily find, so for our tiled project, I'm going to place this in our Levels folder. If we hit Save, this should now create our JSON file. And now to create our foreground and background images, we'll want to disable all of our layers in our level. Now for our background image, we want to enable that layer. Now if we go up to File, we're going to do Export as Image. And now we need to provide our location and our file name. So if we click Browse, so now for our file name, we'll do dungeon_1, and we'll do underscore, and we'll do background. We're going to place that image also in our Levels folder. So if we do Save, now we want to do Export, and that'll create our image. Now we want to do the same thing for our foreground. So we'll enable our foreground layer. We'll do File. We'll do Export as Image. We'll do Browse. Now for our file name, we'll do dungeon_1. Now we'll do underscore, and we'll do foreground. Let's hit Save. We'll do Export, and now we should have our 3 main files. Once we've exported out our data, we can add it to our phaser project. So to add our files to our phaser project, we'll want to place that under our public, our assets folder. Under our assets folder, we'll go into images, then we'll go into levels, and under our levels, we'll go to dungeon 1, and now we'll have our 3 files. So for our file names we add, we want to make sure we follow this pattern since this is the assets we'll be looking for our game. So our folder should be called dungeon_1, and then we'll have our 2 images, so our dungeon_1, our background, and our foreground images. Then we'll have our dungeon_1 JSON file, and now this will have all of the metadata we'll need for our phaser game. Since our project template already includes the finalized level files, our JSON file and images, we'll be using those versions for the rest of the series. This ensures everything is correctly exported and set up. However, if you're creating your own dungeon level, just follow the same steps to export the required data and update your game accordingly. Our final game will include 2 levels, the dungeon and the main overworld. While we won't go through the entire overworld creation process in the series, a completed version is included in the tiled project files. The overworld level that's included is intentionally small, but with our structured approach, you can expand it as needed to customize your game further. The process for creating the overworld follows the same steps as our dungeon level. You'll want to create your tile layers for our foreground and background layers, and then you'll want to paint tiles onto those layers and export those out as images. You'll want to set up your player and your enemy collision layers. Finally, you'll need to add your object layers, so you'll need to add your objects for your rooms, your doors, your enemies, and any other interactive objects that you want in your overworld. And so one thing that's different between our world level and our dungeon level is we have multiple layers that actually make up our background and our foreground. So while we're designing our levels, sometimes it can be beneficial to create multiple layers to represent our background. So in the example here, we'll see we have separate tile layers that represents the various parts that we're drawing onto our map. The main thing here is we place all of these tile layers into a group layer called background, and now when we go to export out our images, we just need to make sure our background layer is enabled, and then that way we can create our background image. Then likewise for our foreground, we have 2 different layers that make up our foreground, and since we have multiple layers of trees, it makes it easier to paint our tiles and get this effect here. So when we go to export out our foreground image, because we have multiple layers, we'll want to make sure both of these are visible when we create that image. Besides this, the rest of the layout of our level should look the same as our dungeon level. We'll have our collision and our enemy collision layers. We'll have our rooms object layer with our rooms for this current level. And then we'll have our various object layers grouped by the room where our objects exist. For the overworld level that's included, there'll be a single room with one door that allows us to connect to our dungeon level. And so to link the overworld and dungeon levels together, we need at least one door with the correct transition properties. So for our single door that we have our overworld level, and so for our properties, we're setting our target level to dungeon_1. So this matches the name of our tile map that we're creating, as well as our JSON and our two images that we need to load in. And then for our target door ID and our target room ID properties, we have both of these set to 3. And so this will match our door that we added into our third room that has our ID of 3. If you modify the map, simply repeat the export steps for the JSON and the background and foreground layers, ensuring the file names match the required formats. So for our world level, we want to make sure our 3 file names are world.json, world_foreground, and world_background. For these 3 files, they'll need to be placed in our public, our assets, our images, our levels, and then our world subfolder. That concludes our section on using Tiled to create and export game levels. Now let's move on to integrating them into our Phaser project. That's it for this part of the series. If you found this helpful, be sure to hit the like button. It really helps out the channel. And if you're following along, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. If you have any questions or want to share your progress, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. Alright, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.